Welcome to the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast, where Gauri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Our guest today is Merlin Carter, Senior Content Writer at Project A Ventures. Project A Ventures is a venture capital investor focusing on early stage startups. Welcome, Merlin, to Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for asking, Merlin. So, in order to just get everything into context, please help me understand a bit more about yourself and how did you initially got into documentation?
Yeah, sure. I'm originally from New Zealand, where I studied communications and journalism. And then I moved to Germany a bit later. And I started actually working as a product manager for a software company. And I wanted to study again. I wanted to study fine art here in Germany. So I needed a job that I could do part-time. And I was very keen on writing specifications, and that was my favorite part of the job. So we thought that it would be a good role for me to do part-time, switching over to documentation, switching over from product management to documentation. And basically, instead of writing specifications, I would turn other people's specifications into user documentation. So that's how I first got into it. And then I evolved over time into different documentation roles.
Fantastic. So how long have you been involved in writing documents? It could be for many companies. So overall, how many years have you been writing contents?
I would say since around 2009. So we could say just over 10 years.
Fantastic. That's quite a long period to have this as your main career. Very nice. So in all these years, I'm sure you might have come across various processes, or you might have defined few processes as well. So what, according to you, is your documentation process, and who do you normally get involved in it?
Well, so in the middle of my career, the development team started to work with the agile methodology, and I think they started working in sprints, and then later they switched to Kanban. But the key agile principles remain the same, and so you have a kind of a process flow where each feature is iterated upon very quickly, and small pieces of functionality are supposed to be ready after the end of each sprint. And so the idea was that also documentation was included in it. So not only was the feature ready to be tested by the QA team, but also there was documentation available for them to also double check. And so that was a little different in contrast to how I had originally started, which is, I guess you could call a waterfall process, where the software was released in say 6 monthly iterations, and then I had to document everything at the end when everything was complete and finished. So a good process, but technical good documentation does need to slot into the agile methodology, I think, and you don't want to be left with huge amounts of work at the end of a release. Rather, iterate on each feature as it's finished, just in time.
Fantastic. So when you're defining your process, what are the important factors you consider when creating any such documentations?
Yeah, so there's quite a few connection points for documentation. First of all, I think the technical writer can also be involved in the specification and the planning of product features. And a lot of large organizations, they're a little bit siloed in terms of how they organize people. So it's not always easy for a technical writer to get themselves involved in the planning phase. But I think the earliest you can start writing documentation, the better. So initially, I would wait till the developers had actually built the feature before I started documenting it. But I realized that you could actually if product managers write good specifications and definitions, you can write documentation out of the user story and anticipate how the feature is going to work, so you can save yourself the work further down. So I guess in summary, that if there's a step that involves at the beginning of the process consultating the technical writer in the design phase, that's great. Not all people manage that, but that's what I try to encourage.
Very nice, great. So, either it being in your business or in any SaaS solution, what role does documentation have in your success, customer service, or success strategy?
Yeah, so there's a blurry line between, I guess, documentation and what I call documentation embedded in the user interface. So I've worked on SaaS products where obviously self-help and self-onboarding or automated onboarding is very important. So new users can understand the process as quickly as possible. They get an invite email, and when they first open the user interface, they get some hints and resources. You can use some tools like WalkMe or UserLane, which guides the user through the interface. And those kinds of things, although they're disparate pieces of content, I also consider that documentation. And then you have your traditional documentation portal where people can go for reference information. But I think you want to keep, assuming you're dealing with a SaaS platform with a rich user interface, like Salesforce or Google Cloud or whatever, you want to keep the user, stop them from leaving and try and onboard them in context. So in terms of customer success, a friendly, seamless onboarding helps to retain customers and gives people a feeling of satisfaction instead of frustrating them, and then reducing the number of support emails you get at the beginning of the onboarding process.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Great. So this is one question that a lot of my other podcasters or participants struggle to answer. So do you think you can measure the ROI from any documentation?
Yeah. So I have to give a brief overview of my background at one particular company to answer this question. So I was employed for most of my time at a company called Acrolinks, which was software for measuring content quality. So I was writing user guides for people who write user guides. So the software service the technical documentation industry. Having said that, any software that gives you some kind of automated score of content quality is great. There's software out there that can give you the flash reading ease or other basic metrics about grammar and spelling issues. But the nice thing about Acrolinks was that you could report on content quality on a grand scale. So you could look at all the documentation files in your repository or scan websites and get different content scores for different parts of a website or what have you. So at the time, I hadn't really seen anything comparable to Acrolinks in terms of getting a bird's eye view of content quality metrics. It's basically something like a very good companion to Google Analytics. So another thing in determining quality is obviously visitor numbers to certain articles and bounce rates on different pages. So yeah, I think quality is measurable, definitely, if you use the right metrics. And so the things we looked at were, clarity. We in terms of the Acrolinks score, there was a clarity metric which looked at variation in sentence length, whether you use the correct company terminology, consistency in terminology, all these things. There was a whole bunch of factors that went into this quality metric.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely possible to measure quality. But your question was about ROI.
Yeah.
That's a trickier one. So I tried to actually, put a business case for using Acrolinks in my subsequent employer here, and technologies, and that was really hard because you had to somehow quantify the time spent resolving issues, or the time spent correcting things. And so I guess we based it on the time spent for a developer or to someone to fix a problem in the documentation, and multiplied it by the number of things we found by automatically scanning it. So the closest thing you can get to that in terms of comparison is maybe developers have these code scanning tools which they use to automatically check the quality of their code. And you can definitely quantify the ROI on that. So we use that as a paradigm to quantify the ROI of content issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, great. So are you generating any organic search traffic from your knowledge base at all?
Yeah, so in terms of keywords, we do write for certain keywords. I was influenced by my time at Acrolinks because they actually had an automated checking component for findability. So I was writing the documentation on how to optimize your content for findability. And I had to eat my own dog food, so to say. I had to make sure that the documentation itself was also findable. There's no point writing about findability if people can't find your documentation. So, and I did look at organic traffic. I mean, to be honest with you, the search, it really depends on the search, the quality of the search in your own documentation platform. Mm-hmm. So we'd use Zendesk previously, which was, wasn't bad, but a lot of people preferred to find the content on Google. So although they knew it was somewhere in Zendesk, they would actually perform the search on Google and get to it from there.
Great. So are there any particular article or category that you have measured where you get this organic search traffic from?
Because people generally, I've written a lot of developer documentation, and so people search a lot for the names of API calls or the methods because they can't remember exactly how it's spelled or what have you. So it tends to be a lot of reference material, and also the stuff that you would expect when you're onboarding, like installing this or updating this, and so on and so on. So those are the two main types of content that they would match on the search.
Great. So how often do you update your documentation?
So I would say, I'm writing more blog content now or tutorials, but previously we would update it after every sprint. So there would be 2 weeks. And so, and at the end of each sprint, the idea would be we would deploy changes to the SaaS product to production. And at the same time, we would deploy any documentation changes to those, the new documentation for the new features. So I guess the short answer is every sprint, every 2 weeks.
Very nice.
Occasionally I would do hot fixes if I noticed a typo. Mm-hmm. It's quite easy to update the documentation independent of a normal release. So that wasn't a problem.
Nice. One thing I want to understand is how big is your team right now? Like how many writers, and do you have segregation between the writers, reviewers, and publishers?
Yeah, so this one I'm going to have to talk about my past experience again, because I think I mentioned I am currently more of a blogger right now, but last year I was working for Hair Technologies, and I worked in two very distinctly separate teams. So the last team I worked in was a SaaS platform for managing automatic software updates over the air, and I was pretty much the only technical writer, and people who reviewed the work were actually the product managers, and so there was no one else reviewing it and there was another part-time technical writer who was also reviewing it for the language, but most of the review was for technical accuracy. And in the year before that, I was with a much larger team of technical writers. So 8 people, 4 in Europe and 4 in the US. And we did a lot of peer reviewing of our work as well. So there was no one who was officially just a reviewer. It was more that we swapped work and reviewed each other's work.
Very nice. Great. So I think with that, we move on to the rapid fire round. So who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
Yeah, well, that's an easy one. When I was at Acrolinx, as part of some kind of deal, I got training from two IBM authors who wrote this book called Developing Quality Technical Information. They were Michelle Carey and Elizabeth Wild. They were contributors, and they sat me down and gave me an interactive editing through all the documentation that I'd written, because at the time I was fairly new to the field, and we took apart everything I'd written. It was a little bit brutal, but it was incredibly helpful at the same time. So I would say those intense 2 weeks I learned the most.
Fantastic. So can you share a documentation related resource you have recently consumed?
Let me see. What was my favorite documentation resource? I was using the tool that I used most recently is called Antora, which I really liked. For developer documentation specifically, because it enables you to pull content in from various GitHub repos very easily. Is there anything else?
Okay.
Oh, wait a second. No, there it is.
Yeah.
And another thing is I really enjoy the work of an author called Steven Pinker, who's a psycholinguist, and he wrote a book called The Sense of Style. And although it's not specifically about technical writing, it does cover a lot of academic writing. And it basically scientifically breaks down the way to write, to use a good style, and really clarifies it. But I think that's a fantastic resource for anyone who writes.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those information or resources. What is the one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self?
Well, my 20-year-old self is still studying to be a web designer, but assuming I was getting into the tech doc field a bit earlier, I would say don't document everything that people tell you to document. You're going to get suggestions from QA, from product managers and developers, and there is such thing as too much documentation. So you don't have to write everything down. And I would say don't write based on tasks rather than just a sequential description of all the features, which is how I originally started. But I realized you need to write things according to what people actually want to do, not how the product is structured.
Nice, great. Is there any other information, Merlin, you would like to share with the audience today?
No, it's just that my feeling is that a technical writer is a really a kind of an interface to a lot of different roles, and I feel some technical writers don't want to talk to people in marketing, or they're kind of hesitant to reach out to different departments. And I would just encourage people to get involved in all the different departments that are involved in content, because there's a lot of overlap. And technical and user guides, technical writing, that's actually marketing as well. A lot of people make buying decisions based on what they see in the technical documentation. In fact, I do that when assessing other systems. I read the documentation first before I even get on the phone with someone. So be involved with other content creating teams, even if their content isn't as technical as yours.
Fantastic. That's great, Merlin. So thank you very much for sharing your unique experience and your journey. So again, appreciate your time you spent with us today. Is there anything you would like to add before we say bye to the podcast?
No, I think that's it. Those are my words of wisdom.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for listening, and have a good day.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.